Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's IOP Speaker Series event, Brat Summer, Unusually Warm Fall, and Real Talk on Energy Policy. Co-sponsored by the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, part of the newly established Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. My name is Vani Kapoor, and I'm a second year at the college from the greater Boston area. I'm double majoring in political science and economics and currently minoring in molecular engineering. Outside of class, I spend most of my time attending IOP Speaker Series events like these and also working with our school's Energy and Climate Club to gain a better understanding of how the student body can work to lead the renewable energy transition. I'm particularly interested in emerging clean technologies. Tonight, we're joined by an outstanding group of panelists. Dr. Ernest Moniz served as the United States Secretary of Energy under the Obama administration. With an unparalleled career spanning academia, government, and the private sector, he has been a leading figure in shaping U.S. energy policy, particularly in the areas of nuclear security and clean energy innovation. Heidi Heitkamp is the director of the IOP and a former U.S. Senator from North Dakota. Throughout her Senate tenure, she worked across the aisle to champion energy, agriculture, and veterans issues. Starting her career as a lawyer for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, she remains committed to the cause and continues to advocate for her community, particularly those in rural areas who are often most affected by climate change. Professor Michael Greenstone will serve as our moderator. Professor Greenstone is the director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth and the Energy Policy Institute. He's also the former chief economist for President Obama. His current focus at the institution centers on the research and implementation of clean energy policies as global economies continue to grow. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. First, please silence your cell phones. And when it's time for Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience over there. And please line up and remember that priority for questions will first go to students. Finally, please make sure to go to politics.uchicago.edu for more information on future speaker series and other opportunities at the Institute of Politics. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Ernest Moniz, Senator Heidi Heitkamp, and Professor Michael Greenstone.
Okay, you guys ready to begin?
Can you turn the lights down? Right, okay.
So thanks to the great IOP team who named this event, Brat Summer, Unusually Warm, Real Talk in Energy Policy. Thank goodness I had to drive my daughter 10 hours to college this summer in August, and she taught me what Brat Summer was. I learned about Charlie XCX. For those of you guys who don't know, I don't want to presume that's true of either of you, but Brat Summer, this is according to AI, is a viral trend in style aesthetic inspired by Charlie XCX's album Brat. Both of you own it, I assume. The trend is characterized by a bold, carefree mindset and a distinctive fashion style that's edgy and Y2K inspired. The term brat has been transformed from meaning obnoxious or demanding to being a term of empowerment that embraces your chaotic and messier side. So that's how we're going to do the interview.
All right. I heard Y2K. I'd be happy to talk about that.
You're about that age.
All right.
And so I prepared a series of questions, but I thought it would be best if each of those questions was motivated by a lyric from Charlie XCX. So here we go. The first comes from her song Rewind, where Charlie XCX says, "Sometimes I just want to rewind." And so we have an audience filled with students here, and I want to ask both of you to rewind a little bit. And I think these students are probably wondering, you guys were once students, how did you get where you are today? And so I want to start with Heidi. I did a little digging. It's been reported that you worked in construction as a teenager and had tough summer jobs while at the University of North Dakota in the 1970s. You'd come home smelling like stale milk after cleaning a creamery, and you always carried a pipe wrench.
In my back pocket.
In your back pocket. So
Yeah.
how did that become this?
Well, it's interesting because, and I always like to calibrate, especially students, because when you think about the environmental movement, which was, kind of emerging when I was in an undergraduate, literally you couldn't eat fish out of the Great Lakes, literally. They're too contaminated with mercury. In LA, you couldn't see across the street. In Denver, you couldn't see us across the street. And I had a law professor, eventually. I went to law school at Lewis and Clark, which is an environmental law school. Went to law school, and it was a guy named Don Long. And he decided, along with a bunch of other professors at the University of Wisconsin, that he would use old nuisance laws because there was not a Clean Air Act. There was not a Clean Water Act, and they had aluminum canoe that they would put in the river and then test the effluent that was coming out of pipes from factories. There was so much contamination in the river, they would have to take the canoe out because it would react and get too hot. And so I always like to kind of tell those stories. I started out kind of in this whole area of environmental compliance and environmental work at a time when there was no doubts that something very dramatic needed to happen. What we didn't talk about was climate. We didn't talk about CO2 emissions. That was invisible. That's what bubbled out of your soda. It was not a contaminant. And if you had to do a rewind, I think going back and looking at kind of environmental regulation, the ability to do something earlier in the climate space, to develop earlier techniques, earlier technologies, even though wind power was emerging at the time, but that was more about price. I think if you had to do a rewind, I think the rewind would be having a discussion back in the 70s and 80s about the potential of CO2 and what that means for climate.
Ernie, I've long admired your intellectual insights and achievements, also your street smarts decision-making. Yet, upon a little research, I learned that when it came to deciding on what college to go to, you saw a picture of a guy on a motorcycle with a woman riding behind him, and that caused you to choose going to Stanford. So I wonder if you could rewind us back from that to where you are today.
That's a correct
How did that
story,
happen?
except it was not for undergraduate, it was for graduate studies.
Okay.
So, but actually, if I go back even before that, I'm actually, this dates me, I'm afraid, but I'm basically initially a child of Sputnik. When Sputnik went up from the Soviet Union and the United States kind of panicked, among the actions taken was a profound revolution, really, in how science and math were taught. And that revolution, I was lucky that the high school, big public high school I was at, was one of the beta sites for the new physics. So we stopped having to study steam shovels as the old physics was, and did things like ripple tanks, and great stuff. So anyway, so that got me off into physics. Long story, skipping over the motorcycle and the blonde, they did come to be realized, I have to say, but it was a Triumph 500. I'd be happy to discuss in more detail. Not the woman, I'll discuss the motorcycle. But then ultimately, after my PhD at Stanford, I went to MIT, and what was very interesting, and there's a certain thread here actually between MIT and Chicago, in the sense that both were institutions, academic institutions, that played a prominent role in the technology development around World War II. Mm-hmm. And at MIT, I'll leave it to you to speak about Chicago, but at MIT, that included a very deep-grained commitment to public service. And so that was especially true in the physics department, given the connection to World War II. And so in 1976 or so, the head of the department of physics at MIT came to me and said that I would be part of a new study of the new panel on public affairs of the American Physical Society. And when I said, well, you know, I don't know anything about the subject, but B, you know, I really got to get tenure. Well, when the department head says, if you don't do this, you're not worth tenure, you do it. And there came the marriage, really, of the science background with the public service background. And that then led to lots of stuff, obviously, following. But I would agree with Heidi that the serious discussion around climate, so I've had two threads, and I continue to have two threads. One is on the clean energy climate, and another is on especially nuclear security issues. And on the climate, I agree with Heidi that we could have benefited from a much earlier and deeper discussion around this rather than waiting until the starting gun really went off in a certain sense, and I would say in 1992 with the Rio meeting, and then really picked up steam later in the 90s, and has continued to do so, I would say, scientifically and technologically, although as we all know and we may discuss, not adequately in the policy world. And then if I go to the nuclear security thread, which we probably won't come to, I'm guessing, in this discussion, I would just say that, and I say this especially for the students, many of you were born after the Cold War ended. Many incorrectly thought that meant the end of the nuclear weapons risk. Well, unfortunately, we are in a period where that is on the ascendancy today. Again, we won't discuss it, but it's an area that, in addition to climate change, I would argue you really need to think hard about in terms of the security environment as you start off on your own careers.
So what Ernie's leaving out is when we were colleagues at MIT, he came to my office and effectively told me that I needed to stop working only on economics papers and help out with the MIT Energy Initiative and the Future Solar Study. So
yeah, so
passing on the tradition.
So on that first thread of the clean energy and climate, I was Undersecretary of Energy in the Clinton administration, and while unexpectedly, most of my time was spent on the nuclear security side because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and then Russia, et cetera. But when I went back to MIT, as Michael inferred in his remarks, I started something called the MIT Energy Initiative, and Michael was a charter member of the faculty group that put together what has been an extremely successful, now 20-plus year effort, and I could only wish you, Michael, equal success at the University of Chicago.
All right. Question 2, in her song, Girl, So Confusing, Charlie XCX says, girl, so confusing, which led me to think a lot of people find energy policy so confusing and climate so confusing. And I wondered if both of you could talk a little bit, which I think sometimes we forget, how different does the picture look than it did in 2004, 20 years ago, or in 2014? And I think sometimes with all the alarmism about climate, and much of it justified, we can miss what the trends are in the big picture. So I don't know if you wanted to start, Heidi, or?
Well, I mean, I can start, but I would go back further. So if you think about 1980, deregulating natural gas. At the time, you couldn't use natural gas in power generation because it was considered too rare. We were deregulating oil prices, and everybody assumed that that deregulation would drive up prices. Guess what happened? Deregulated and prices tanked. The windfall profits tax never turned into a big revenue producer because there was no windfall profits. And all of a sudden, I think you've got to take a look at the development of technologies in the oil and gas industry that led to the United States being the largest producer of oil and natural gas. In fact, if you look at the natural gas side, very low cost natural gas, and what that meant for any kind of conversion in the energy space to other kinds of renewables. And so all of a sudden, that the idea was that these prices would go up, that would drive up competition for geothermal. At the time, people were still talking about hydroelectric, and that we would see a greater all of the above mix. But as fossils continue to be, as we would say, if you don't consider the externalities, as fossils continue to be considered one of the lowest cost sources of generation of electricity, including coal, it was incredibly difficult during this time period to encourage the development of renewables. Enter tax policy and policies like production tax credits, which led to a whole development. Ernie and I can give you chapter and verse on, kind of the deals that were done there. Enter the tax credits, investment tax credits for solar, which were driving the development of those of that source further. But yet there was always an assumption, I think, that fossils would eventually reach a price point that would equalize the mix. That never happened because fossils got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Now, what's interesting about this administration is they keep talking about wanting $40 a barrel oil. And I will tell you I come from a large oil producing state, was second, now is third in the country. At $40 a barrel, they will maintain production, but they will not develop new areas or new production. It's not cost effective. And so what I would say is this intersection between climate and energy, when you say energy policy, there's never been an energy policy. There's been, I think, an idea that the market would do these adjustments and that there would be increased development. I don't think that's happened the way economists would think it would happen or politicians would think it would happen. But at the same time, low-cost energy has been a huge economic driver for this country. And that's why I think I'm going to put a plug in for the work that Michael's doing at the New Institute. This idea of that you can't, the lesson that you should learn is that as you're looking at what you're going to do with energy, you have to have a energy policy and a climate policy that really addresses cost of energy, because if the cost goes too high, it will drive public policy away from energy policy. And I think we can all argue about what's too high, and we can argue intellectually about externalities and whether the current pricing system bakes in the externality of climate. But at the bottom line, that person living on a fixed income who is going to pay the bills, or the energy worker who's making $130,000 working on a rig and the transition is offering him or her only $50,000, these are things that will drive policy. And to have sustainable policy, we have to be honest about what that looks like in terms of cost of energy to the average consumer. I don't know if that answers.
Ernie, so what do you think are the developments over the last couple decades?
Well, first of all, by the way, I'll come back to this, but one of our problems is, of course, we don't have the policy to incorporate the climate externalities. But let's come back to that.
But we should probably just all pause and appreciate that both of you, a scientist and a politician, are using the word externalities here at the University of Chicago.
That's right.
But
and it didn't feel terrible when you said it, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, you got to remember, my legal degree is basically in environmental policy, and if you didn't know the word externalities, you would get an F at Lewis and Clark Law School. So.
Well, I've previously stated publicly that the greatest pejorative term I can use is academic economist. It doesn't. It doesn't prevent me, however, from bowing a little bit to that language. But going back to the question, I think I'm going to start out with the positive, then we'll come back to the compliment. But on the positive side, I think we can easily lose sight of the fact in our inability to, in my view, to address the climate challenge at adequate pace and scale, that nevertheless, the discussion has evolved very, very dramatically, actually, in the last 20 years. I think the certainly public opinion is not quite at the point of supporting a strong policy, but it is at the point where I think the reality of climate is largely being acknowledged. Frankly, extreme weather, which is bad news in and of itself, but the increase in extreme weather, which regrettably I think is just going to keep increasing, is nearing the public, I think, to a tipping point where some action some real action will be called for. In the meantime, what we do is we stumble through with a policy that I would call carrots and twigs. We're not ready for sticks yet, but we got a few little twigs here and there. But it's mostly carrots, and that includes, I think, a very strong bipartisan commitment to innovation, at least in the technology sense. The private sector with a pretty strong commitment to business model innovation. We're seeing that in multiple sectors, especially, let's say, urban mobility, for example, complete new business models. Policy innovation, as I've suggested, is falling short at the moment. I would also say that a positive is that we're seeing, just in the last 2-3 years, frankly, a movement towards a more pragmatic discussion than we had for many, many years, in which there was really a bifurcation, in some sense, ideologically. I think on the environmental side, I think that there's a recognition that we're going way too slow, and we've got to throw every solution we can at the problem. On the other side, there's recognition, like through extreme weather, that we are heading to a low carbon future. The pace and scale remain to be determined, and there are bumps in the road. We may have had a big bump in the road just a couple of weeks ago, but the fact is we're heading there, and I think there is some convergence. We've got to close the gap, and we're not there, but there is some convergence towards a more pragmatic discussion that we can't afford to turn away from any solution at all. Now, having said that, what is a policy going to look like? I don't know. But let me take one example that will not come to pass exactly in the way it was proposed, for sure, but kind of as a way of thinking about we've got to bring a lot of elements together. There's something called, it came out now, geez, it must be 10 years ago, a proposal from former Republican secretaries of state, George Shultz and Jim Baker, in which they said, okay, we're going to have to take something that will maybe not satisfy everybody fully, but will satisfy everybody enough to get a deal done. So on the one hand, they advocate for an escalating carbon emissions price, a tax on carbon emissions, and it would go up with or exceeding inflation each year. So that would be addressing the climate change mitigation side. Then they come back and say, okay, now if we have a tax, it's a lot of money. If it's $100, we're talking more than $500 million a year of funding. Well, what are we going to do with the funding? Their argument was, send it back to the people in equal amounts so that it will be a socially progressive tax. The poor will get more funding back, than they are expending through this tax, and the wealthier people will be opposite. They will be paying in. Third, they say, we should impose a carbon border adjustment when we are charging a lot for carbon emissions. Others who are not will have to pay an import tariff based upon the carbon content that they are not taxing, if you like. And fourth, they argue that, well, when you have all of these elements in place, you can afford to peel away a whole bunch of incentives, some of those carrots, et cetera. Now, again, I'm not saying that's going to be the solution, but if you think about it, how that appeals to different political constituencies, it's fundamentally addressing the carbon problem. It addresses the social equity issues that Heidi was fundamentally referring to. You can't do this on the backs of the poor, because not only is it the wrong thing to do, but you will just generate, as we have been doing, intense political headwinds on the climate side. And it's not only in the United States. Many of you may recall several years ago the so-called gilets jaunes, yellow jackets in France. The president of France decided, I got a great idea on climate. I'm going to increase the tax on fuels. Well, that didn't work out so well, because the pushback from those who depended upon that, not the wealthy, workers who depended upon those fuels, pushed back, and I would argue France had to take a step backwards on climate because of not fully integrating these issues. So that's what I think we're coming to. We're not quite there yet. I think we're going to get there. We are going to a low carbon economy. When? How much? We'll get there only when we fold into one conversation climate, security, social equity, bankability, global south. Those are one discussion, and until we get sophisticated enough to put them all into our policy discussion, we're not going to solve any of the problems.
Okay, so you guys I had a perfectly curated set of questions which you guys have
ignored.
Broken the barriers to. But I am going to try to stick to Charlie XCX, since she's our leader here.
I have no idea who you're talking about, but it's all right.
We'll talk about it at dinner. In her song Apple, Charlie XCX says, I split the apple down symmetrical lines, which I take to be exactly what you were just saying. We have to find a way to balance the need for minimizing the risk from climate and the need for continued robust growth. I want to point, both of you have done many great things, and you're seen as climate leaders. And both of you took decisions that I think in some way or another are related, that maybe the pure climate people might not have appreciated so much. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about it. So Heidi, I'm obviously thinking about the removal of export restrictions on petroleum.
And
then Ernie, I was going to ask you about how you thought about LNG export terminals and the exporting natural gas. So like, it's super impressive. You guys have somehow found some way to do this balancing act. So I wonder if you could talk about it a little bit.
When I was in the Senate, I came with a fairly, extensive energy background, served on the board of directors of the largest synfuel coal gasification plant in the country.
And I have to say, it was economically successful, because they bought it at 1 cent on the dollar.
But we kept it operating, and
that's the important thing.
I want to say, to this day, it's the largest industrial carbon sequestration project in the country, certainly in North America, probably in the world.
We've been there together.
I just want to say that. Okay, so I thought, okay, I believe that climate is a problem, but I also have constituency groups, whether it's coal miners, whether it is energy workers who work on rigs, and I need to figure out how do we move in the right direction, but bring people with us. And so I said, okay, one of the big challenges that shale oil has is shale is light, sweet crude. we don't really refine light sweet crudes in this country. And so what was happening is we were producing more oil than what we could refine in this country. But because of a 1970s energy policy that said you can't export crude oil out of the lower 48, you could out of Alaska, but you couldn't export it out of places like North Dakota. Our oil was landlocked. I didn't see the difference between that and a bushel of corn. So I said, okay, we're going to open this up. And Ernie and I had this discussion actually in North Dakota when he came to talk about the quadrennial report, energy review. And so I said, but I'm not. I mean, I'm going to advocate for this, but there's got to be some amount of give and take. And so we ended up doing a deal where we lifted the ban on oil exports, which no one thought we could do, convinced the Democratic caucus to do this. But in exchange for that, we were doing what we called year-end extenders for the production tax credits, the investment tax credits, the clean energy tax credits would only get extended at the end of the year. There was no certainty to them. Let's build out certainty so they know that that investment is not going to get stranded and they'll get the tax credits. And so we did a deal that involved basically putting the energy tax credits for renewables on steroids at the same time that we were lifting oil exports. None of that that was probably one of the biggest climate successes in the 10 years that I was in the United States Senate. The other initiative that I did, and I always said, I'm the only person I know who had Sheldon Whitehouse and Mitch McConnell on the same bill. And that was to basically, carbon capture is, we can argue about that as a technology, as a strategy for clean energy, but we had what's called 45Q, which is a tax credit for sequestering carbon, but it was only limited to the enhancement of secondary and tertiary oil recovery. And so we said that doesn't make sense because we've got other industrial processes that we should be able to do. It shouldn't require that you ship this to an oil field. And so we basically opened up 45Q to other industrial processes like cement, and we could talk about that, and basically expanded the availability of these tax credits, which hopefully led to a lot of thinking about the development of carbon capture as a real strategy moving forward for meeting climate and CO2 restriction goals. And if you look at across the board at the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which everyone says big climate bill, a lot of what came out of that was taking a look at tax credits and providing some certainty in tax credits to basically drive, as Ernie says, that's the big carrot, that's the big enchilada, to drive development of technologies. But that was, we led. So I always said it was ironic because I always got criticized for being pro-fossil, but the two biggest climate bills that went through when I was in the Senate were both led in compromises with fossils, compromises that we believed would actually achieve climate goals but continue to have sustainability of policy. And so, it goes back to what Ernie was saying. You can't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I will say this, one of my biggest challenges was meeting this sense that all fossil fuels are evil. If I had a woman at Harvard, I was a fellow at the Institute of Politics in Harvard, and she was from Alaska, and she came in and she said, I don't like you. I said, okay, well, why not? I think most people like me. And she said, well, you're against the Green New Deal. And I said, I've never said I was against the Green New Deal. I said, what is it? And I asked her, what about conservation? What about nuclear? What about all of the other strategies? And I said that when we will get good climate policy when we become fuel agnostic and carbon sensitive. And so I would just suggest, and especially as it relates to natural gas, that we need to open up our aperture and use all available tools of where we are economically to move a climate agenda forward, and not be rigidly anti-something unless it is truly a challenge in the climate space.
Okay,
So you facilitated the
Yeah.
exporting of natural gas, and yet you still have climate friends. How could that be?
Right. So first of all, I take your point, Heidi, and I will now talk about the policy of enchiladas and twigs. Right. But I'd like to actually first make a comment on this export renewable tax credit deal. Heidi said this, but let me just be very, very clear. And I would say this mostly for the students as you become policymakers in the future. You gotta do a deal is what it amounts to. Having ideological positions should mean that you know where you want to go, you know what your values are, and you stick to them, but understand that to make progress, sometimes you got to do a deal. Now, if you looked at this deal, and I would say Heidi was on the Hill and I was at the Department of Energy, this was 2015, and we were pushing in the same direction. If you look at the outcome of the deal, the outcome, that's what's important. Did you head towards the goal that you wanted and not to some other goal? The reality is, look at the data. From when that deal was cut in 2015 to up to the pandemic, up to the COVID pandemic, say 2020, renewables took off.
Yeah.
Because the tax credits gave certainty, as was emphasized, 5-year horizons. What you may or may not know is before that, these tax credits had 2-year terms, and it was a yo-yo. For 1 year, people would build wind farms, and the next year they would build nothing. Well, it just took off because the tax credits were part of this condominium. So what happened on the oil side, the oil exports? Look at the data. Total world oil demand, 2010 to 2020, an absolute straight line. There's no kink in 2015. Market share changed. The United States has now gone from about 8 to 13 million barrels a day, and OPEC has lost market share. So market share changed. Oil demand was unaffected. That's a pretty good outcome.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the fact that we got to work on the demand side for oil, for fossil fuels. But it's the demand side that is critical. That's a segue into LNG. In 2010, we had barely any natural gas production from shale. Took off. It already started, but then it just took off to where now, again, we are the biggest gas exporter in the world. And we have more under construction that will double what we're doing. And we have approved even more. I think that we're not going to see all of those built because of the demand side. I'm suspicious that there will be anything like the global demand to support that. But if I come back to the United States and go back to the 1980s, which was originally discussed, those policy restrictions, it's always unintended consequences. Those policy restrictions on gas that was there through the 70s and basically impeded markets in the 80s, you know what we got for that? Coal. That's when coal became the big dog in power production. And now what's rolled it back is gas.
Yes.
Yeah.
More than half of our carbon reductions in the United States, and we have reduced carbon emissions, not enough, but we have reduced substantially. The power sector is down about 30% in carbon emissions. More than half of our overall emissions reductions of greenhouse gases, not just CO2, has come from gas now substituting for coal, when coal, in some sense, substituted for gas back in the 80s. So we've really got to think, what are the practical outcomes that keep moving us towards where we want to go? Now, in the gas situation, and including LNG exports, we've learned a lot more, including the fact that we have to do a lot more to clean up the production, because we have too much methane leakage. Now, methane, this is again, think of this in terms of the policy decisions that you're going to face down the road. With methane, it's a very short-lived gas in the atmosphere. Let's call it 15 years, versus CO2 hundreds and hundreds of years. And so we can be complacent and say, okay, CO2 is the only issue versus methane. It's not true. Unless we work to reduce methane emissions so that the problem will go away in a relatively short time. But we've done a lousy job, to be perfectly honest. Some of the big companies have done a good job, but overall we have done an inadequate job. So that's where our policy has got to be. By the way, that's one of the twigs that I currently referred to. We do have a little bit of a price now on methane emissions, but it's only a twig.
In principle.
That's right. So anyway, so that's important. But I want to end by going back to this fundamental trade-off that Heidi talked about in terms of the oil exports and the renewables tax credits. Right now, we are living through another example of some of our friends shooting themselves and us in the head by not understanding how to pull off a trade. And that is on what is called the Manchin-Barrasso bill. It's basically a bill that is out there. I don't think it's going to make it across the finish line in this Congress, but we'll see. But the basic idea is it does a trade. The trade is that we will greatly streamline the possibility of permitting long-distance, high-voltage transmission lines in particular, exactly what is needed to unleash huge renewable potential in the middle of the country and get it to load, in return for some permitting of fossil fuel development in public lands, and the possibility of making sure that natural gas exports are going to be reviewed in a timely way. I would argue that the latter is going to look, in hindsight, just like that oil export thing. It's going to be a straight line, and we got to work on the demand side. Whereas the permitting side would free up big-time renewables in terms of wind and solar. So we just got to be practical, outcome-focused, and make those trade-offs that actually advance us to where we want to go in terms of low carbon.
Can I just add one example to that? In the Northeast, when it gets really cold, they fire up diesel generation, electrical generation. It's expensive, and it is stinky, and it's bad policy. 22 miles of pipeline, natural gas pipeline, would take care of that problem. Much cleaner source of generation, a cleaner air source. Can't do it because it is a fossil fuel power line or pipeline. And so this is what we're talking about, which is the ability to be agnostic and think about the numbers, think about the data, and quit knee-jerking. If it's natural gas, it's bad. That's absolutely not true. In fact, Ernie just told you half of the reductions in this country in CO2 have come from conversion from coal to natural gas.
What a great advertisement.
As time goes on, that dynamic changes.
Yeah.
And so we got to keep changing.
Right.
We can't just be stuck in the mud. None of us can be stuck in the mud. We just got to think about the current situation.
But we also have to be realistic about base load generation versus intermittent power.
And in fact, just to give one more example. Sorry, Michael, but one more example because I fear you're going to give another lyric.
I do. I have more than you know.
Another one is, many of you have undoubtedly read about the enormous electricity load growth. And right now, data centers and AI are the poster child, and they are indeed driving the near term. But it's not going to be only data centers. It's electrifying vehicles, electrifying heat pumps for space heating, industrial processes, maybe cryptocurrency, maybe green hydrogen in the future comes in. But right now it's data centers. The reality is, for all kinds of reasons beyond climate, economic reasons, security reasons, etc., that load is going to be met. We have put ourselves in a position where the utilities don't know any way to meet that load in the near term without natural gas. That's just a reality. That's going to lead to more carbon emissions. What our job should be is not to complain about that, it's to roll up our sleeves and figure out how do we do something differently. 10 years out, it's shame on us if we don't today lay the groundwork for carbon-free, large, firm electricity sources that are going to take over 5, 10, or 15 years down the road. That's the thinking we've got to do. Crying over spilt milk doesn't get us anything. It's pragmatically thinking about what are the solutions that can get us again to where we want to go.
And I want to make this point about if in fact you looked at back-end carbon capture behind natural gas, which is doable, and you say, okay, we're not going to give you any certainty. We're not going to, give you 20 years of certainty of a power plant. If you build out this power source, that investment will not be made. And so that's why in energy policy, it is so important to have long-term energy policy, because these are huge investments that you're asking people to make, whether it is regulated utilities or whether it is private independent power sources.
And part of that longer term firm power can be today making sure that the provisions are in place for those natural gas plants to be able to do carbon capture in the future, so that they themselves can be very low carbon firm power sources.
So I'll just underscore, both Heidi and Ernie have tried to capture, I believe, the need to have more than one goal, and that's certainly at the center of the new institute that we've launched here. So let me now turn...
Actually, Michael, can I just modify that slightly? It's okay to have one goal if that's your goal, but it's not okay to have only one goal and act like there aren't other goals that other people have, and you got to combine them and find the way forward. You got to build a coalition. So if you want to have one goal only, that's fine, but you got to act in ways that you recognize that there are a lot of others who may not share that unity of goal.
All of which brings me to another lyric. So I think she wrote this without knowing that...
Why aren't you singing these?
That Donald, there's very good reasons for that. Or one very good reason, actually, not multiple reasons. I don't think she knew Donald Trump would be president, but in her song So I, Charlie XCX says, always on my mind, every day, every night, your star burns so bright. Donald Trump is our president.
No, it's your turn.
No, it's your turn.
No, your turn.
So what are we going to get? And so just, we've got Chris Wright, nominee for Energy Secretary. Lee Zeldin, nominee for EPA. Doug Burnham, who I'm sure you know, nominee for Secretary of DOI. What's coming?
Well, I think it is perceived to be a very good time to be involved in the oil and gas industry. That this will, I mean, you've heard drill, baby, drill. We're going to reduce prices. We're going to, really put more of that energy into the market. We used to have an expression, because I spent a lot of time looking at natural gas prices. I'd say the solution to low natural gas prices is low natural gas prices. And what gets forgotten all the time, it's not federal policy that drives this to the same extent as economics. It's 101, supply-demand economics. And so when they say we're going to drive the price of energy down and that's going to create energy independence, I would argue that those are counter proposals, because we have a pretty stable oil and gas development industry at $70 a barrel, or at $3.25 for the price of a gallon of gas in North Dakota. That's higher in other places, depending upon policies. But what I would say is that underneath all this, and I'll leave this to Ernie, because Ernie and I had that conversation earlier, underneath all of this is American businesses who say, that might be good for the next 4 years, but we don't know what the next 8 years look like. We have to basically prepare for a carbon-constrained world. And I don't think that they're going to give up. I don't think this university is going to give up the work that they're doing on battery development. I don't think that they can stop the kind of innovation that's happening in direct air capture and CCUS and all of the things that have been put in motion. Now, I do think that the Biden administration is being way too optimistic when they say, we put this machine in motion and they can't stop it. I'm not sure that's true. We have a president who has promised now, a president-elect, to repeal the IRA, which is where a lot of this kind of carrot stuff is. We will see what happens overall with climate policy. Embedded within the Farm Bill is a lot of farm programs, and we can have a debate about whether we can capture carbon by using different kinds of farming practices. But there is a line of thinking that this is yet another economic stream. In states like North Dakota, 90% of all land is engaged in production agriculture. Production agriculture has a role. I worked with Saxby Chambliss with the Bipartisan Policy Center. We issued a report on what could make that work better. And so there's just a lot of thinking out there that they can't stop, and there's a lot of innovation out there that they can't stop. But the stated policy of this administration is going to be drill, baby, drill. We're going to reduce costs, and in my opinion, that's counterproductive to actually having energy independence in this country.
So no carbon price at the social cost of carbon of $225?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
And even though many energy companies, including Exxon, has been supportive of a carbon price or a carbon tax, that is not going to happen. And you aren't going to see cap and trade. You might see a border adjustment tax, which has bipartisan support. Both Sheldon Whitehouse and Bill Cassidy from Louisiana support it and have been promoting it as an idea to equalize between what other countries are doing. But I think that there's going to be very little climate policy. I think climate policy is going to come out of institutions like this for research. That could come out of private companies who know that just simply looking at a 4-year gain is not good long-term strategy.
Well, I agree with the main thrust there. In fact, I would just note, and I'm not going to be Pollyannish about this, because I think it will be different in President Trump 2.0, but in President Trump 1.0, if you look at the carbon trajectories, frankly, there wasn't much of an impact at all. And the private sector was a big part of that. Because as Heidi says, the private sector, certainly in the energy business, makes big capital commitments with very long time horizons. And they know what I said earlier. we are going to a low carbon economy, even if we don't know exactly the pace and scale. And extreme weather is going to be, in my view, again, one of the big guarantors of that, unfortunately, of that coming true. Now, I don't have confidence that there will be similarly small impact in the next 4 years, but that dynamic will be there, providing a stabilizing influence. Secondly, if you go back to Trump 1.0, the Trump administration, the executive branch, every year proposed to the Congress a substantial cut in the science and technology, clean energy science and technology programs, the R&D and demonstration programs. Every year, the Congress, in a bipartisan way, ignored it and increased the budget. There is a very, very strong bipartisan commitment to innovation. You may not want to use the climate word every other word, but operationally, I think that's going to be the case. And by the way, Michael mentioned the nominee for the Department of Energy, Chris Wright. Chris Wright is one of the pioneers of the big oil and gas production boom through hydraulic fracturing, but he also has been very, very clear that he's kind of all of the above, wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear. He's on the board of a small nuclear company, an innovative company, and he has stated explicitly that I think I'm quoting him, we need to put the pedal to the metal on innovation, by which he meant technology innovation. So there are going to be some strong voices in support of innovation going forward. On innovation, we should always remember that the real goal, Heidi said this a while ago, the real goal actually, in the end, in the energy business, is cost reduction. Yeah. There are some new services that will come, especially through the integration of energy technologies with IT and AI and the like. But when all is said and done, cost reduction is the big deal. When you have cost reduction, boy, policy gets a lot easier. And so I'm a physicist by training. That makes me an inherent optimist, unlike the economists in our crowds. So I think we're going to get there. As I said earlier, technology innovation and business model innovation are alive and well. Yeah. Policy innovation, that's where we need to step on the gas.
I want to just add something. Overlaying this, we've forgotten to talk about state governments and the roles that the public utility regulators and state policy plays. Obviously, California, Minnesota. I mean, I can give you example after example where the policy of the administration may be drill, baby, drill, but the public utility regulators are saying you have to have a different mix of your...
Well, and state energy policy, not only regulators. In fact, I should have said in Trump 1.0, there was the private sector, there was the innovation budgets, California. But there was also the big state initiatives.
The renewable portfolio standards, EV mandates.
And those are all going to come to play, although the state initiatives are not clearly all the states, but nevertheless, large parts of the population are in the states that will pursue those policies.
Well, the largest producers of renewable energy is Texas.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Okay.
And I might add, in fact, I've just come here from Texas because of an enormous push there to become in the usual Texas lingo, the nuclear capital of the world. So there's going to be a lot happening. And on drill, baby, drill, I'm going to add one more point. I think, the president-elect has said drill, baby, drill a lot. And Mr. Wright is certainly comes out of the oil and gas industry. Governor Burgum has a strong fossil industry in North Dakota, as you well know. But don't forget North Dakota also with renewables, the best state in terms of preparing for CCS, et cetera. And drill, baby, drill. I maintain the position that whether it's oil or gas, the issue is going to be on the demand side globally. And if I were in the oil and gas business, I would not be so bullish on where demand's going to go.
Okay.
And on the climate side, I would be more bullish about where demand's going to go.
So we're at a university, and the students come first. So it's now time for questions, and I think the IOP rule is the first 3 questions must come from students, and there's a microphone here, and we're being blinded up here. There might be a second microphone as well, but we would be thrilled to have questions from the audience, starting with some students.
They're all very shy today.
Yeah. I have some more lyrics I could start.
I think there's a hand there, but it's hard to see here with the lights.
Yeah.
There's a microphone over there.
Yeah.
It is hard to see.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really enlightening. And as per reports, nature's carbon sink absorbed net zero CO2 last year. Now, Heidi, you talked about carbon sequestration and externalities. Now, even if we were to internalize the externalities through carbon tax credits, now where does this new development place us in terms of need to re-engineer our energy and climate policies for real impact?
That was a question to you, right there.
Well,
You're
I mean,
a physicist,
right. I mean, I think what I always say is, if we were creating a perfect world, we would do things so much differently. That's why I said if we could rewind, and using the lyrics, we would take a different approach. In the United States, unlike other places where they have in fact decided their environmental policies are externality driven, we're a regulation command and control. And we've been unwilling to regulate CO2. We've tried it through the Clean Air Act. One of the casualties of this last election is that they will withdraw any attempt to use the Clean Air Act to regulate CO2. And that's been back and forth in the courts. And I would say, because we've been fighting the litigation about what the definition is of a pollutant, we haven't gotten busy dealing with CO2 in the environment. And so what I would say is, I live in the real world, and that real world, there aren't going to be a lot of sticks. There aren't even going to be a lot of twigs. And so what everybody is hoping for, and you should never have hope as a strategy when something is this critical, what everybody's hoping for is technology development, the kinds of things that are being done here at Argonne, the kinds of things that are being done across the globe, really. And so what we have to do is we have to invest in innovation, but we also have to look at where's the low-hanging fruit in the climate space. And I would tell you, I believe the low-hanging fruit is natural gas. It's what we can do with natural gas, with back-end carbon capture, what we can do with these technologies, and they're finding some challenges because of permitting. And so I guess I would just say, let's take a look at what we can do, to meet kind of some immediate demands, including, no one gives Walmart credit for what they've done as being an innovator in the conservation space, right? We haven't done enough in conservation of energy. Efficiencies, we have to have that in the data centers. What does that look like? How are we going to drive this new load? And so what I'd love to tell you, that we're going to price out the externalities and all the bad polluters of CO2 are going to pay the price. That's not true, because we're all consumers of CO2, because we enjoy in this economy low energy prices, and those low energy prices do not take into consideration the externalities of CO2.
I'm just going to add something on the technology side, since I think I'm the technologist up here.
Well, you are.
On the panel. That look, clearly there's going to be a lot of R&D, a lot of innovation, continuing on the whole suite of technologies that have been referred to here and others. But I also want to emphasize that there are also the possibilities of kind of out of left field kind of big breakthroughs that are hardly on the radar screen today. Nuclear fusion is an example where fusion's been around for a long time, but without a lot of people paying attention, a lot of private money, $7 billion has gone into fusion, new concepts, and it's looking like it might actually work and would resolve all kinds of problems. Another example, the possibility, and these are all possibilities, they may be nothing and they may be complete game changers. Geological hydrogen. Because if geological hydrogen, literally hydrogen that coming out of the earth, as opposed to being made from water or natural gas, if geological hydrogen is ubiquitous and scales, and we don't know the answer to that yet. We do know that a village in Mali is fully operating on geological hydrogen. That's not the same as scaling globally, but that would be a huge deal, because if it is successful, it's probably very inexpensive. And suddenly you have, roughly speaking, the new natural gas,
right.
Except without that carbon atom attached to it. And then another hybrid breakthrough could be geological hydrogen as stimulated in the earth in concert with geothermal energy. This is a new area of research. If that works, could be a huge breakthrough with substantial cost reductions. So I just want to emphasize that it's not only the things that we are doing driving the cost down, as has happened historically with wind and solar as examples, or batteries now, but also completely new breakthroughs could happen. One other point I'd like to add, which is not quite on the question, but nevertheless is important. I think that, there's been a lot of, I heard the words net zero. There's been a lot of talk about net zero by 2050. Net zero by 2050, globally, forget it. We can talk about the United States and Europe, but I just ask people, don't you listen? For example, China and India have explicitly talked about net zero at dates beyond 2050. Not to mention the fact that we have to expect, it's when you factor in all of the human needs and aspirations, we are going to have differentiated decarbonization according to levels of economic development. That's just a reality. It doesn't help for us to put our heads in the sand and believe that it ain't so. So we've got to manage the system to get there, recognizing that we have to address, for example, economic development, women's empowerment issues, all kinds of issues in the developing world at the same time. It's a big job that all of you have got to solve.
Nor does it help to lecture those countries, I think. That is not a very productive
I will put my head, lean forward a lot in saying, because that's an important point, Michael. Frankly, President-elect Trump, by his own statement, I'm not making this up, he's a very, shall we say, transactional person. Well, in a different area, the West got a rude awakening on the Ukraine issue when the global South didn't rally behind our position. In the same way, there may be an ironic preference in some of the emerging economies for a transactional approach as opposed to a lecturing approach. Yeah. These are hard realities that we have to face.
We have 3 minutes left, and we're going to try for 2 questions. which is going to impose some discipline on our esteemed speakers here.
And the students.
Yeah.
Well, what you're
So far, the students tracker has been pretty good.
I fear that in the short term, voters are going to benefit from policies like lower gas prices and continue to vote for these policies in the long term. Do you think that there's going to be enough momentum from the private sector and at local levels to build up a climate movement in the long term, even with a continued national government like what we're going to have in the soon?
I will tell you very quickly, everybody is talking about their insurance bills. That's not getting any better. And so when you look at we talk about externalities and that we don't see these costs, we're seeing them in cleaning up behind natural disasters. We're seeing them in insurance bills, people not being able to get insurance. Literally, if you think about the whole state of Florida, it's a sandbar. You can build maybe a seawall in New York City. You can't build that in Miami. And there's already tides that basically flood the entire downtown of Fort Lauderdale. And so, we're suffering those costs, and I think the more those costs get talked about, the more there's going to be a drive from voters to have this problem addressed.
Yeah, I agree, and it just goes back to the broader point. I think Heidi just gave one example. Extreme weather. Extreme weather is very expensive, and it's not just floods, but it's also fires and droughts and hurricane intensity and all kinds of things. And I continue to say I think this is going to be the tipping point. It's then reflected in things like insurance costs. And one of the things that I've said a number of times, I'll repeat it, is that we do love our children and grandchildren, but we really love ourselves. And the fact that the costs are coming due on this generation, I believe, is going to move us much faster along the resolution pathway.
And just to throw out another challenge, climate migration, certainly happening in Northern Africa.
Yeah.
Okay, I want all of you to join me in thanking.
One more question.
There's nobody out there.
Question.
Okay, I can't see if there's another person there. So this is what I'm gonna, there we go.
There we
Here's
go.
our last question in 20 seconds.
All right, so at my high school, we had a big climate summit, and somehow Iran got nuclear missiles and no climate policy was passed. So I was wondering, we probably won't reach that point, but are we headed towards less productive climate summits in the future, especially with the change in presidential policy on a global scale?
You're the guy. You're the guy.
Okay.
But just be gentle. There's a University of Chicago students who are at the current climate summit who are enjoying it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Personally, I think that the COPs, the climate, the big climate summit meetings, if you like, can be, and some have been, consequential. I would single out COP28 last year in Dubai because it kind of changed the conversation in the ways that I suggested earlier. Much more pragmatic. Words that were not allowed to be said in polite company before, like nuclear, could be actually discussed, etc. They were, of course, the Emirates have the wealth, so they could be very forward-leaning and put $30 billion on the table for an investment fund in which they could accept the fact that they would take more risk than the private equity funds to try to stimulate investment in the developing countries. So that's an example, I think, of a COP meeting that was very important. Will that series of summits actually lead to something like formal agreements that really are binding? I doubt it. I think that's going to come in a different channel, yet to be defined. And I think that, frankly, until China, the United States, and Europe in particular get on the same page, it's going to be very, very hard to reach there. So I think that's the dialogue that has to go on, not replacing, but in parallel with those summits. Those summits move us along, and then you got to close the deal. And that's going to require, I think, those big players.
Heidi, it's your show. You want to give us the last word?
Well, I mean, I think, anytime you have a discussion about an important issue and you bring and convene people, it's never a waste of time. But the problem is, you take Paris. Paris was the initiative. Were you Secretary of Energy?
Yes, I was.
There you go.
And I moved mission innovation in Paris. That's not funny.
When I was in the Senate, and that the immediate reaction to Paris is that the Obama administration can't speak for this government. This is a deal and it was all hortatory. I mean, it was all aspirational. There was no mandates in the Paris summit, and so but did it set a dialogue? Did it bring people together to talk about what the innovation is, what's new, what are you doing? And so I don't think there's ever a problem with people getting together and talking. If you want global government, that's not what we've got. And certainly I will tell you, as we use the phrase, I don't know, I don't like using it, but the global south, they're looking at all of us who have been polluting CO2 for a lot of years, saying, now you want me to use expensive power because you guys want to, because you guys did this? That's not fair. And so, bringing everybody together to have common purpose is a good idea.
Michael, just a brief comment.
On Paris?
Yeah, on Paris. I think that underestimates Paris in the following sense. This question of evolving the conversation. In the 90s, we had a very unproductive and unhelpful discussion. And bluntly, that included the Kyoto summit, COP meeting, because it drew a bright line between a few industrialized countries and the rest of the world. Whereas Paris, the whole world adopted, they weren't binding, but the whole world adopted these targets, NDCs, so-called. And that's a big evolution. So I think kind of principles get established slowly in this sequence, but again, we got to close the deal, I think, in a different
and
way.
The Paris
you
thing
can't
was
do it a consensus.
Unlocked by the U.S.-China agreement.
And China-U.S., exactly.
Yeah, 2 months
China
before.
and U.S. came together before the COP, and that changed the game. The same way it happened for COP28 last year. Yeah. China and the United States, it freed everybody else up to play.
Okay, with that, please join me in thanking former Senator Heitkamp for putting such a